What is international order and what has it been? How does international relations understand this thing and what are its shortcomings? What does it do? Why do we talk about international order? We're going to come at this same question of international order from the criticisms and the challenges, both from the left and the right. Globally, but like primarily from within the United States, because as we'll talk about today, it's the United States that has been the dominant power in the world system. It has been the hegemon. And so we have to figure out how much of what we call international order is something more than just the will of the strong. Or maybe it just was that. And there's lots of consequences that we're living through now based on how we understand that question. There's two different ways of talking about this. One is to call it the LIO, Liberal International Order. In 2017, 18, 19, everybody talked about LIO was the thing that everybody referred to.
Be it resolved, the international liberal order is over.
It was taken for granted. It dominated every conversation. You open the new issue of Foreign Affairs, every article is about it. You go hear an ambassador talk or a foreign minister talk, and they're all about like blah, 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 defensive liberal international order. It's like, what the fuck are you talking about? What is this? 10 years earlier than that, ain't nobody was talking about that. This word never came up. This phrase did not exist. And as of 2020, 2021, you also never hear anybody talk about this phrase, liberal international order. Ever since in 2021, 2022, 2023, people stopped talking about LIO and they started saying rules-based international order. And now, I mean, for the most part, nobody even talks about that. In the past 12 months, 14 months, rules-based international order has sort of dropped out of the vocabulary. You still have onesie-twosies. Countries like New Zealand still claim to index their foreign policy against this thing. This is supposed to be like the North Star of New Zealand's foreign policy. And yet it was this hot thing that everybody talked about, and now ain't nobody talking about it anymore, like it doesn't exist. So what's that about? And why has the term shifted at certain points in time? And why did ain't nobody talk about this 15 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago? As a concept, what is, you can say it interchangeably, but like RBIO or LIO. There's at least three different ways of understanding it. And again, this is not explaining it as a variable, like as a cause or effect. This is just saying what the concept is, right? So the first understanding of it is that it's just a set of rules, laws, international norms that America wants and then America expects others to follow. And maybe America follows them, maybe it doesn't. And they are subject to change by America, and it's still expected that others will follow them, and maybe America does, and maybe America doesn't. That's one way of understanding what is being referred to here. And if that's your definition, it looks really stupid to say that's the foundation of our foreign policy. Right? So surely if you think this is the foundation of your foreign policy, this concept, you don't accept that first definition, right? You probably accept the second definition, in fact. A collection of international institutions and practices meant to bolster basically an open international system. Open in the sense of human mobility, immigration, open in the sense of free trade, the flow of goods, and open in the sense of capital mobility, financial flows, right? Trade and investment. And that's supposed to sustain peaceable relations among capitalist societies, capitalist nations, governments. That was thought, this is being revised in real time, but up until recently, it was kind of believed that if you had a system of open trade, open flows, open migration, that this was actually favorable to democracy, as long as that system did not allow inequality to get out of control, right? It's a big asterisk. That's why there's an asterisk there, right? There's a third way of understanding what this is, LIO, RBIO, and that understanding is that it's not a real thing at all. It's a fake thing. It's an imagined object created through Speech Act by policy elites and some scholars who support those policy elites in order to securitize the geopolitical relations of the West with Russia and with China, primarily with China. So in this third definition, to talk about the liberal international order is literally the same thing as saying China threat, which is to say that there's no thing here itself. It's just a way of making sense, because you have to have, in securitization theory, right? You have to have a referent object. What is the referent object? Like, what is the thing that's under existential threat? Well, China doesn't pose an existential threat to anything in the real world, really. Taiwan, bracket that off for now. But like, from a US perspective, China doesn't threaten anything about America existentially. So you have to have an object that you can claim is existentially threatened so that you can defend it. And so the view is that you start with the prejudice against China, just like in the 1980s, there was a prejudice against Japan. They used to call it the yellow peril. We've been going through something similar with China right now. But the whole reason for the yellow peril was arguably a sort of racialized view of world politics, but more directly, that this rising quote unquote yellow power was challenging US primacy. And that's what US foreign policymakers cannot allow. Even when I was a US foreign policymaker, that was like taken for granted that, of course, you can't allow others to eclipse your power. And Japan was a US ally, a US client state in the 80s. And still, we got freaked out about the Japan rising threat, the Japan that can say no. That was a famous book, a bestseller at the time. God, can you imagine a world where Japan could say no to us? Do you hear how crazy that is? But in the 80s, that was like a reasonable hot take. That was like the title of a best-selling book. So these are three like pretty wildly different ways of understanding the same concept of liberal international order, rules-based international order. What we should not lose sight of, no matter what definition we prefer, any international order, not just this international order, any international order, it's going to depend on rules of some kind, and those rules are going to benefit some and probably come at the expense of others. And who? How much? That's a like basic question that we should always be keeping in mind, especially if we think of ourselves as like humanists or we believe in the value of human being, human life. Do you want an international order that calls for human sacrifice? And are you okay with it being you? No? Oh, but how about others? Who others? How many, right? These are reasonable questions, necessary questions. They are also questions that in my generation of IR scholars, we never fucking asked. Never even thought to ask. And you wonder why the system got so highly inegalitarian over time. Because we weren't paying attention to questions of who benefits and who is harmed. So just taking quickly the third definition, there's a feature in Google, the Google Ngram. Do you guys know about this? You can search any keyword or phrase that you want from the beginning of time up through, I think, 2022. And it will tell you the number of times it was mentioned. It's like this way of tracking the popularity or the frequency of a word or a phrase over time. And when you search liberal international order, for the most part, It doesn't even exist until the 2010s. When was China rivalry with the US? Like, when did that start? Arguably about 2015, so the 2010s. And as Sino-US rivalry becomes, as this phrase, great power competition, strategic competition, as that becomes the language of policymakers during this era that we're sort of like still kind of in, then this phrase starts getting used not just more frequently, but like astronomically more frequently, right? Off the charts. And so this is a pretty simple cross-check. If the liberal international order is a real thing and it's something more than just talking about China as a boogeyman, surely John Locke was talking about it. You know, surely the founder of liberalism was talking about it. Surely in World War I, they were talking about it. Surely at the beginning of the Cold War, they were talking about it. Liberalism was a dominant politics through all these eras. So where was the phrase? It was pretty much not there at all. And it's the same if you switch the phrase to rules-based international order. It is exactly the same. The phrases are interchangeable. They only start to happen with the onset of Sino-US rivalry in the 2010s. And as that rivalry heats up, this phrase, frequency use, just goes through the roof. Just this simple engram makes scholars look like a bunch of sheep. Like we're all, like we're all just recycling the vocabulary that other people are using or whatever. So this is pretty like validating of the third definition, but nothing is conclusive. And this third definition is not mutually exclusive with the other definitions. It's just to say that there is something valid about this understanding, and this understanding should give us pause. Does it make sense? Should we be doing foreign policies anchored in this concept of like rules-based international order if this is what it is, even if this is partially what it is? Does that make sense? Now, the second definition was this idealized definition. And I think this is the definition that like policymakers here have in mind when they use the phrase, right? So it's about the institutions and practices that bolster democratic capitalism, give or take. We could quibble with that. And in this understanding, there are two pillars of what this international order is. The economic pillar is deliberate design starting at like the rebuild after World War II. So the Bretton Woods system, which was initially anchored in gold, right? So it's like this monetary stability for international currency. The Marshall Plan, which is this US mega investment to rebuild Europe, which was not so much a Christmas gift for Europe. It was the need to like rebuild their economies so that their societies would not be vulnerable to fascism. So that was part of the logic of the Marshall Plan. And then, of course, we have all the institutions established at the end of World War II and then throughout the Cold War. So the EU being one, the World Trade Organization, which used to be called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the IMF, the World Bank. All of these are sort of like institutional expressions of the liberal international order in this idealized view. The economic dimension is not all there is. It's actually underpinned by a security architecture. And that security architecture is US unipolarity ensconced in a bunch of institutions. And those institutions range from, bilateral alliances in East Asia, right, with Korea, Japan, Australia, Philippines, sort of Thailand, or the multilateral institutional arrangement that is NATO, of course, in Europe, right? And the point of NATO initially, I don't know if you've heard this phrase, NATO's origins, it was keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. All of this rests on top of a foundation of like American extreme concentrations of power. Like the share of power that America has relative to everyone else in the world system. It's extreme share, right? And so the institutions are a way of sort of binding that or steering that in certain ways. And then if you take a cynical view, those institutions are venues where America's extreme power can be expressed. They're the vehicles for American extreme power. A less cynical view is that they're a way of constraining American power. And Americans themselves, American policymakers, disagree over time, even today, about are these institutions a threat to our power? Are they an extension of our power? Or are they some weird third thing? You know? And like Americans don't agree about that, which is why you sometimes have a lot of schizophrenia from Washington about things like international law and international institutions and fidelity to them. Anyways, this is how the second definition understands international order, right? Now, if you think of the liberal international order, rules-based international order, I'm just going to say one or the other because saying them both is like exhausting. From the 1950s up through the 2010s, we have the rise of the global north getting richer and richer. So liberal democracies, more or less, getting richer and richer, right? We have the classical rivalries between, for example, like Germany and France being suspended. Those rivalries were a source of conflict leading up to World War I and leading up to World War II, but not since. And then, of course, since World War II, we don't have great power wars. Both World War I and World War II were great power wars. There hasn't been a World War III. There hasn't been US and Soviet Union going to war, US and China going to war. It just hasn't happened. So these are outcomes in the real world. We can say these are the dependent variable. The liberal international order, or whatever you want to call it, for some people is the independent variable, the cause of these outcomes. Large, not just American policymakers, but like disproportionately American policymakers designed all these things, wanted all these things to come into existence. And you go back into the historical record, part of the reason why they wanted it was because they thought it would cause some of these outcomes, protecting this odd relationship called democratic capitalism, right? This experiment that we lived through in the 20th century where we tried to make democracy and capitalism compatible. Is it still compatible? Who knows? Was it ever compatible? Who knows? Those are different debates. But there's tensions logically between democracy and capitalism that were never totally resolved. And in the 20th century, we were trying to make it a thing. We were trying to make those things be able to coexist. You know, from an IR perspective, international relations theory time, right? This is what we did with like World War I as well. There's different ways of major theories trying to explain the 1, 2, 3 phenomena here, the dependent variable. So if you just take straight balance of power theory, right? States tend to balance against power, right? So one way of balancing is the formation of alliances. This point of view arguably accounts for the alliances that formed during the Cold War after World War II. It arguably accounts for the absence of great power wars, which is like balancing keeps aggression in check, right? But it doesn't have anything to say about economic integration or rising wealth anywhere, right? Balance of power doesn't think in terms of economic factors, except for economic factors that help you build military power. right? Like an industrial base or something like that. So balance of power theory has a huge blind spot for some of the things that we care about. The democratic peace theory, we haven't really talked about it in this course, but it's just the theory that democracies tend not to go to war with each other. It's this belief that like there's different reasons why people think this is true, but it has tended to be true over time that democracies do not go to war with each other. And so this view, this is like one of the most dominant theories in IR, it would explain, of course, why democracies since World War II have largely not gone to war against each other. But it has nothing to say about the stability of relations between democracies and non-democracies, which are generally thought to be like tending toward hostility most of the time, right? And yet, you know, Sino-US relations were cooperative, mutually cooperative from the 1970s up through the 2010s. The US had good relations with Russia for a period after the Cold War, right? Russia was not a democracy for most of that time. And so the democratic peace theory does not really have anything to say about this relationship between democracy and non-democracy, which has been stable. You know, it also has the same economic blind spot as balance of power theory, right? And then there's a third theory here. These are, by the way, these are like the three biggest theories in IR just generally. So like anybody who goes through IR, whatever you may learn or not learn in that program, you will have like a studied familiarity with these three theories, right? And lots of arguments about them. So the third theory, economic interdependence theory, we talked about this a bit in week 6. This explains the rising wealth of liberal democracies, right? Rising wealth of the global north. It explains the old rivalry suspension, arguably. Countries like Germany and France, when their economies are bound together, it increases the costs of conflict, and therefore it increases the incentives to cooperate. But the economic interdependence doesn't really explain why great power wars didn't happen during the Cold War, for example, right? Because the US and the Soviet Union did not have meaningful economic relations. They were not interdependent. And economic interdependence theory requires interdependence as a condition of its prediction. You see, so like there are things that we care about, like the absence of war between great powers, that economic interdependence theory cannot make a claim to explaining. It could make a claim to explaining the absence of war between China and the US as their economies got stitched together and formed interdependencies, you know, but not with the US and the Soviet Union. One of the reasons why institutions are thought to facilitate cooperation in the world is that they reduce the transaction costs of interactions. So they reduce friction with countries who want to cooperate or work together because they provide like rules and places to meet and all these, like very practical level, right? So they make cooperation easier, literally, if you want to do cooperation, but they also help cast a long shadow of the future, because when you establish an institution, it helps create patterns of behavior which create patterns of expectation. If you keep having this kind of ritualized meeting and you expect to have it again next year, and you know you're going to be facing off with the defense minister from this other country again soon, all of that starts to like affect your calculations. Institutions create expectations of the long shadow of the future, which means whatever we end up doing or deciding today is going to get amplified and happen again and again and again. And that incentivizes us to not just blow shit up, because that's not the future we want to just keep creating over and over and over, right? The other logic is the security side, which is that the strongest powers' commitments to international rules if even the big dog is willing to be constrained by the rules of the system, it makes the rules of the system credible. What does a small country have any business ignoring the rules if those same rules, the strongest power in the system complies with them? Why should some smaller power not comply with them? Like, who are they to violate the rules? There are reasonable answers to that question, even though I posed it rhetorically. But the idea is that, like, according to the logic of like liberal hegemonists, like people like John Eikenberry, they've built their whole careers on making LIO a thing. The logic of what they're arguing for is that America needs to be in these international institutions. Yes, they promote US power, but there are ways for America to like get its way. But also they limit America's power, and by limiting America's power, they prolong it. Because nobody holds on to power forever. Power comes and goes. Different distributions of power emerge over time. This is history. It's a fact. America's power was always going to decline, but institutions, especially if those institutions reflect US preferences, extend the shelf life of American power. This is like Eikenberry's explicit argument. Now, I've tried to put lots of caveats on my words as I talk here, because I'm not trying to like endorse what I'm saying, but I am trying to explain plainly how the advocates of this phrase think about it. And I say that as somebody who once was one of those advocates, like a long time ago, right? One of the things that like really messed with me, though, as I was formerly an advocate of this system, was this question on the slide here, right? How is it that American liberal hegemony being like a kind of consensual domination of the world, how is it that it takes credits for things we like, 1, 2, 3, but not all the other like bad shit in the world? Like, how that seems very cherry picky with reality. If you are by hegemony, like presiding over everything, by definition, you should be accountable for the good shit and the bad shit. And it seems like advocates of the LIO want to take credit for the good shit, and they don't want to hold the bag on any of the bad things that have happened in the world. And how is it that the dominant power in the system is not responsible for any of the bad things in the world? Does that make any sense? Are you fucking serious? Do you worship power that nakedly that you think power can never be wrong? Are you fucking kidding? That was like my light bulb moment. It's like, oh, wait a minute. Maybe I need to start thinking more critically about all of this. So I've just walked through all this like liberal stuff. There's a dissenting view about the LIO. Realists of different stripes have been like really critical of the LIO, not just the logic of it, but what politicians are doing with it. They think that going back to this whole like, if this 1, 2, 3 is really what we're focused on is explaining, the realists think that all this stuff, all these institutions, it's all just the will of the strong. Yes, they are rules. Yes, there are institutions. There always will be. There's never going to be a world where there are no rules and institutions. But the realist point of view is that those things, those institutions and rules, are always just a reflection of power. The unipolar peace theory, if you want to call it that, is the idea that American primacy is both necessary and sufficient for international order. The liberals say, of the LIO variety, they say that American primacy is necessary but not sufficient for international order. Because yes, it needs to be underwritten by American power, but their focus is on the institutions, the arrangements, the practices, the norms. The realists are like, doesn't matter. It's just like you're focusing on the wrong thing if you're focusing on the institutions. That's what they tell us, right? And so why haven't there been great power wars? I mentioned this, I foreshadowed this a minute ago, because American dominance is so extreme that nobody can catch up. Why are you going to arms race the hegemon? You crazy? This was the belief. This was the belief, right? Things 5 years ago, I think this view had a lot of currency. Like people were really embracing this view, partially because everybody was starting to recognize that like this LIO thing was falling apart and they wanted an explanation. And realism offered a very easy explanation because it's like, well, you're focused on the wrong things. The right things is the distribution of power. The problem with that is that states absolutely tried to balance the US. We're living through that now, right? The BRICS nation, the BRICS formation itself is kind of like a counterbalancing coalition, to say nothing of China, to say nothing of Russia, right? So like this idea that like American dominance prevents arms racing is factually not true at this point. So the problem, in sum, with the realist view of the LIO, or one problem, is that even if it's correct, it is increasingly irrelevant as an explanation in the world that is going on right now. The belief that American power is good for the world used to be compatible with facts, but people would debate it. It's increasingly not compatible with facts. It's increasingly obvious that it's not good for the world when it's being used, American power, to violate international law, to violate US domestic law, right, to violate human rights, to change the rules at will, which we'll talk about a little bit on Wednesday. So we are in an increasingly multipolar world. The realist view of why we had stability for the past 40 years suggests that like it was all about unipolarity. So if realists are making a prediction about today, it's that since we're no longer unipolar, we are more primed for a war in various ways, right? And that may not be wrong. Now, there's a question about like how liberal is the liberal international order? This came out a few years ago, maybe 2018. It's called Orders of Exclusion. It studied every great power construction of international order going back to the Concert of Europe in 1815. And what he showed, Kyle Laskeretz, in the book was that every international order that great powers established, which is how international orders come into being largely, they were always designing their rules in relation to threats, which is other great powers or some like ideology or some movement. Every international order has been that. So when we talk about rules-based international order, the upshot of his argument, we're always talking about an order of exclusion. That's the title of the book. If an order is designed by a great power, its rules will be exclusionary. It will not be inclusive. It will not be open, but they will always tell you otherwise. He sort of says this in the concluding chapter, but like, order is stability, like, stable, predictable, rules and arrangements. But it's stability. Stability always favors a status quo, of course. And so that question at the beginning of the lecture, who benefits? To whose benefit? Generally, it's to the benefit of the great power or powers who constructed that order at the expense of whoever their target is. And this has salience because if you remember that third definition of LIO, it was all about exclusion. It was all about euphemism. We're really talking about the China threat, right? So the problem with that is that in this view, and for all great power-based orders, peace is not the priority. Peace is not stability. Stability is about the concentrations of power. That's what they care about. They're not looking for peace unless it's on their terms. And then there's this other question about like, okay, so if you call it a liberal order, but it's by definition an exclusionary order, there's a tension there or maybe a contradiction there. But there's also like, are you actually bound by these rules? A guy like John Eikenberry says that the reason why we do these institutions and the reason why they have a benefit is because they constrain American power. That's the whole logic. Did they constrain American power when it launched the Iraq War or the global war on terror, which was like one illegal action after another? Are they constraining American power now as it's using F-35s and drones to bomb drug mules coming out of Venezuela? There's a hypocrisy at the heart of calling an exclusionary order a liberal order.